the question that many people have, which is there any hope to communicate with aliens, that is contingent on a shared conceptual space. But I'm wondering if I was going to ask if that question should have been rephrased as, are aliens observers like us? Because if an alien is an observer like us, they would have the same conceptual space. But it sounds like you're saying no.
Well, I think the way to think about it is I didn't talk much about this kind of concept of rulal space, but essentially there are sort of different kind of underlying computational rules that you can be running or that you can attribute to being what the universe is running, so to speak. And in some sense, we can think about, we think about ourselves as being at a particular place in physical space. We can also think about ourselves as being at particular places in rulal space. The way I see it is that different minds are at different places in rulal space. And for example, this whole point about exchanging concepts and so on is like these particles propagating from one place in rulal space without change to another. So okay. There's this kind of whole map of minds in rulal space, and minds with sort of common history and same cultural background and same education and so on. Those minds are fairly close together, and communication is fairly easy between them. The translation from thoughts in one mind to thoughts in another is not so hard. As you take those minds further apart, that gets more difficult. Let's say the mind is the mind of a dog, for example. Well, there are some things that you can communicate with dogs, maybe some emotional states, things like that. But lots of stuff is really pretty hard to communicate. And then we can say, well, what about something further away? What about some other kind of computational system that, with the principle of computational equivalence, we can think of as being a mind-like system? My favorite example usually is the weather, which people sort of might say has a mind of its own. But the weather is pretty far away in rulal space from us. It does mind-like things, but the translation from its mind-like activities to our mind-like activities is hard. It's distant. We won't think of it as having experiences like us. When we're looking, and this is always a sort of interesting problem of ethics and so on, when we have certain internal experiences, we look at other people and we say, I imagine those people are having similar experiences to mine. And as those people get sort of further away, whether it's, culturally or other things, it feels less, you're less sort of, oh yes, I can empathize with that person. I can imagine what they're thinking, so to speak. By the time you get to a cat or dog, it's pretty far away. What's the thing thinking? We can kind of make up a story about it, but it's pretty hard to kind of get in its mind, so to speak. And I think that's kind of the, when we imagine sort of these sort of minds that are very different from ours, we just can't get in them in the same way that we can sort of get in another human mind. Now an interesting case is AI, because if you look at people's interactions with AI, and particularly with, a friend of mine just made a humanoid robot that is sort of interesting because you can watch people's interactions with that. It's the LLM AI plus the humanoid robot thing. And it's really interesting because, we all basically empathize with the thing pretty quickly in many ways. It's, even though we kind of know rationally it's a bag of bits, more or less, we still sort of treat it in some rather human way. And, at some level, we could think about, well, every brain is just a bag of neurons with a bunch of electrical activity and so on. Why should we treat it in some special way? We treat it in a special way because we empathize with it and we sort of map it into our own internal experiences. And I think, in the case of AI, we're, in an awful lot of the time, we are going to increasingly sort of anthropomorphize it to the point where it feels like it's something like us, so to speak, just as other people feel like they're something like us, even though we don't have that inner experience of being them, so to speak. So, I think, let's see, I think you had asked about what, sort of communication with aliens and so on. I think that the way I see it is, you go explore the universe. We go send out spacecraft. They get a certain distance. as a spacecraft goes out, to the outside the solar system or something, it has a different point of view about the universe because it's in a different place in physical space. We could also imagine sort of sending out the analog of rulal spacecraft, trying to understand the universe from different points of view like that. And that's, in a sense, that's the big intellectual activity, I suppose, a big intellectual journey of, can we colonize rulal space? Can we get these different points of view about how to think about things? How far out can we get? And I think one of the points is that to even be able to discuss it, we have to have all gone together to some place in rulal space. Otherwise, we don't have these shared words to talk about what's happening.
Right. If we send out something into rulal space and it's sufficiently far enough, would we even be able to say that it's us that has colonized it?
It's a good question. I think by the time we have, I think it's like translating from one language to another. If you've got some sufficiently obscure language, there's probably no English to it dictionary. It goes through 5 steps or something. And that's the kind of thing one would see in that case. And so then the question would be, are you translating to language X? Well, no, it went through this step, that step, that step, that step. So, I suspect that's the way in which, that's how it will attenuate, so to speak.
What would you say is the difference between consciousness and observation?
Well, I think consciousness, in some sense, people imagine as some sort of inner feeling of existing. And that's, what I'm interested in kind of the operation of observers is something that you could say is an exterior membrane to whatever you might think consciousness is. That is, it is asking the question, how do you take what's out there in the world and get it into something that is processable by a mind? The question of the inner feeling of the mind, which I suppose is what you might think of as consciousness, is one that I think is a very slippery concept. Let's start by saying that. I think it's a slippery concept, but I think we have certain feelings for what consciousness is like. For example, this continuous thread of experience is a symptom of consciousness, so to speak. Similarly, this finiteness is a symptom of consciousness. And I suppose that for me, I've been more interested in sort of cataloging the symptoms of consciousness because they allow us to get sort of an idea of what laws of physics we will conclude there to be, so to speak. I've been more interested in that than in asking the more inward-looking question of sort of what is that thing inside that has these particular symptoms. And I think, an exercise I've been doing, I need to finish it, I started it a couple of years ago, is to just sort of write the story of what it would be like to be a computer. It's like you go from the time you're booted up to the time you crash. It's kind of like a human lifetime. You accumulate certain memory, you have certain experiences, all those kinds of things. What's that like? What would be the inner experience of being a computer? Now, right now, we don't project much. People do and always have kind of talked to their computers and said the computer is having a hard time now. It's, the computer feels X, Y, Z, but it's somehow still a little bit distant. I think it will become less distant with sort of humanoid robots and with sort of, steadily better LLM type technology and so on. But I think this sort of, what does it feel like to be a computer is, and we may discover when we, as we try and project ourselves into that, just as we have this non-trivial thing that we're all pretty decent at doing, or most people are pretty decent at doing, is sort of projecting themselves into another human, so to speak, to imagine what that other human is thinking. And, we don't as much imagine what a computer is thinking yet, but we probably perfectly well could. Once we can imagine that, all kinds of terrible things happen because then, our sort of ethical principles about other people and, we don't want the other people to feel bad and so on. As soon as we can feel like a computer, so to speak, we have all those issues for it too. there is lots of intelligence in the universe. Every physical process, all these kinds of things are examples of mind-like activity. The issue is those minds are far away in real space. And in a sense, what we're doing in science, in natural science, is attempting to make bridges across, we're attempting to say there's this system in nature and it does what it does. And we're finding a way so that we can get some human connection to that system in nature. Because otherwise, we're just watching the system doing what it does. And in a sort of pre-scientific society, or for many things even today, that we don't have a way to think about in terms of science, it's just doing what it does. And we don't have this we haven't been able to make this kind of connection to it. And that's kind of how we're able to say, oh, we can, a lot of the connections we make in science today are of the kind where we say, we're going to crush this thing. We're going to be able to say, we know exactly what it does. We can kind of imagine in our minds what it's going to do, rather than it's doing what it's doing, and we have to sort of relate to it in some way, where we're treating it as an equal mind, so to speak, to ours, and we're merely trying to understand it. It's like saying for different humans, you could say, I'm going to crush this, and I'm just going to say, I know how humans work. That person is going to do this, this, and this. I don't have, everything is predictable. But in fact, with humans, we're quite used to the idea that, we're doing what we're doing. Another human is doing what they're doing. We can kind of communicate with them, but they're both sort of equal minds, so to speak.
As you well know, Toe dips its toes, so to speak, into philosophy, both publicly as well as I do so in my personal life. I encourage you to do the same with Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. Nearly 2,000 years after it was written, this guide to personal growth remains eminently relevant for anyone seeking to lead a meaningful life. Meditations isn't your average self-help book. In fact, it was the emperor's personal journal, and this makes it useful not only as a form of propositional knowledge, but to aid perspectival knowledge, something that John Vervaeke talks about as exigent, though missing in our culture. We sit in this improbable, even preposterous position of having the opportunity to peer into one of the deepest, soul-searching, thoughtful, private questions, internal struggles that the once leader of the world thought about in his moments alone. Like, man, I would love to interview him if Marcus were a guest on Toe. Maybe he would be a fan of the CTMU. Maybe he would be a Kastrup sympathizer. I'll leave that up to you. Dive into the philosophies of Marcus Aurelius today with the book that Ryan Holiday said is the greatest book ever written. Meditations is available from Penguin Random House at prh.com/meditations.
With nature, the conceit of a lot of science has been that we are the minds in charge, so to speak, that nature is just, we can just say, we know what's going to happen. We've got the science that tells us what's going to happen, rather than we're somehow sort of co-equal minds with what's happening in nature. There are other traditions, not the Western scientific tradition, where that's much more of a thing. And again, it's challenging for somebody like me to really, even though maybe I have a slight advantage because I've thought scientifically about these things a lot, to sort of get into that way of thinking about things. But that's what I tend to think, that, right around the time when people realize that AIs are not that different from us, that's around the time when people will decide there's aliens all around. There's kind of alien intelligence all around us, so to speak. It is just that we haven't been able to make these bridges necessarily to be able to communicate with it. Kind of an interesting thought experiment came from a pitch some people made me a few years ago about how they're going to make a company in which they're going to send interstellar spacecraft out, and they're going to, go out into the universe. They're going to discover extraterrestrial technology. They're going to bring it back to Earth. They're going to accelerate our technology by 1 million years. Okay, so I hear far out pitches all the time. That one might be the furthest out pitch I've ever heard for a startup, so to speak. But what's interesting about it is the sort of the philosophically unpeeling that pitch, because what's it really saying? It's saying, when we say we go out into the universe and we discover technology, alien technology, we bring it back to Earth, we accelerate human technology by 1 million years. Okay, the problem is there is alien technology all around the universe. There are pulsars doing all kinds of elaborate things with magnetic fields. There are this, there's that. There's all kinds of stuff going on in the universe. The issue is, what is technology? Technology is something where we have managed to reel it in to connect it to human purposes that we care about. I mean, you were asking before, is there meaning in interconcept space? Well, the issue is, it's like saying, is there technology to be made out of this kind of physical process? It's not. The physical process is doing what it's doing. The making technology out of it is, can we kind of reel it in to connect it to things that we care about? Similar to, can we sort of build meaning on top of this thing? Can we connect it to things that we care about? And so what's sort of interesting there is to realize, well, there's technology everywhere. There's not technology. There's the raw material for technology everywhere. But this question of it is this very human activity of saying, oh yes, we found a piezoelectric material. Great. Now we can use that to make a piece of a clock or something.
Sure.
But it's the thing is the thing, and the question is, can we connect it to human purposes? And human purposes have evolved over time. I mean, there are plenty of, it's like, random elements. I don't know, lutetium or something. It's just like, oh, it's a random chemical element, and then people realize, oh no, we really should care about mining it. It's useful for this or that thing that shows up in a smartphone. It's kind of, the thing is out there. But it's a slow process of us kind of colonizing the space of possibilities to realize that's something that we humans actually care about.
When talking about observation and equivalencing, is that to be understood as the same as coarse graining? So you don't care about the details?
Coarse graining is a version of that. I mean, there are a whole collection of different ideas that sort of are all versions of equivalencing. Coarse graining, things being on attractors, compression. There's a bunch of different names for this. I mean, this is a core idea that's shown up in a zillion different places. But yes, coarse graining is kind of the name that Gibbs invented for statistical mechanics in the early part of the 20th century for sort of a version of this. The challenge with talking about coarse graining and just saying, oh, we just do coarse graining and then we understand what's going on. The problem is, what's a valid kind of coarse graining to do? That's the real question. Just say we bucket things together, but which equivalencings can we do? Because there are some equivalencings that are very ornate to do. They would require a lot of computational to be able to figure out, oh, this is really equivalent to that.
Or you can coarse grain so finely that you become synonymous with the system.
Absolutely.
So you can coarse grain down to the level of the atoms.
Right, exactly. But the question is, what is that fuzziness that you're putting on there? What is what's the thing that the fuzzifier is able to do and not able to do? And I think so. That's kind of knowing the mechanics of the coarse graining is important. So it's sort of, you have to discuss the process of equivalencing, as well as just discuss the fact that you have equivalence, so to speak.
Okay, that's super interesting. So would you say that observation is the fact of equivalencing, or is the act of equivalencing?
Well, I mean, the output of an observation is the result of equivalencing. The process of observation is a process of equivalencing. So, for example, this becomes important. Oh, I don't know, for quantum computing, this is important. We don't fully understand this, but it's important. That is, in our models of physics, there's sort of these many possible histories that correspond to a multi-way graph of possible things that could happen in the world, so to speak. And there's branchings, there's mergings. There's continually branching and merging. I think a key observation is that just as we humans are, you could say, coarse graining, are sort of a big on the scale of atoms of space. We're big on the scale of individual molecules in statistical mechanics. We're also big on the scale of different paths of history. So in branchial space, as we call it, the space of quantum branches, we are extended entities in branchial space. Mm-hmm. So we are effectively averaging or equivalencing different branches of history. It's a weird thing. I mean, it means that we, and this is where it's really important, that we believe there's a single thread of experience that we have. Yet, that single thread of experience is actually an aggregate, I think, of many different paths of history. And that's kind of an idea that is kind of this equivalencing of different sort of paths in pieces of branchial space is sort of well, then there's a question of what's the mechanism by which that happens. If we are, and this is what's important for a quantum computer, it's one thing inside the quantum computer that has these many different threads of computation going on. But then the question is, okay, humans are going to be looking at the answer. If they were quantum observers looking at the answer, it would be done at that point. It would have these many threads of computation, and there are lots of different threads, and there are different places in branchial space, and everybody's happy. There's nothing more to do. But to get the thing to the point where us kind of simplistic humans can sort of absorb it, you have to equivalence together these threads of history. You have to sort of find a way to say, and this is what happened. This is the one thing that happened. We can't have in our minds the kind of multiple branches of quantum history. That's a thing that we, in our common experience, we equivalence these things together. So sort of the output phase of a quantum computer has to be this thing where we are doing those equivalencings. Now, the fact is that in the traditional formalism of quantum mechanics, that really doesn't come up. In the traditional formalism of quantum mechanics, and it might be a mistake, the idea is there are all these quantum amplitudes, and then, there's this measurement operator, and kaboom, you just get the answer. And I think that sort of denies the fact that actually there is a process of equivalencing that has to go on to get to the point where you have an answer, to get to the point where you can sort of connect to a human mind that believes there is a definite thread of things that happened.
If you enjoyed that clip, then the full podcast is out right now. You can click around here. Enjoy. Subscribe to Theories of Everything to get notified of upcoming podcasts, as there are new full-length podcasts every week on the topics of mathematics, physics, consciousness, free will, and AI. Thank you to Mark from the podcast The Last Theory, which is on screen right now. Please visit his channel where he interviews someone named Jonathan Garrard, who in my opinion doesn't get enough credit for his work. On the channel The Last Theory, both Mark and Jonathan explain the causal graph, multi-wave, Reuliad, spatial graph, branchial space, causal invariance, various other subjects within the Wolfram's physics project in their mathematical detail.